This week we will be going over child abduction and exploitation. This is a very tough topic because we're going to be talking about kidnappings, runaway, human trafficking, and sexual exploitation or sexual abuse. So I would encourage you all to make sure that you're monitoring yourselves through this material. Like always, I encourage you to take notes and I encourage you to kind of take breaks if you need to. It's heavy material this week. I will timestamp this so that we will that you'll be able to go back and forth pretty easily. All right, with that, let's go ahead and get started. In 2002, the World Health Organization completed a study, and it's kind of a revolutionary study to kind of show us the true prevalence of the issues of kidnapping, missing children, and human trafficking. And what they found was about 150 million girls and 73 million boys under the ages of 18 experienced some type of forced sexual intercourse. And over that, they found that at least the numbers were at least 100,000 children who were involved in commercial sexual exploitation. We call commercial sexual exploitation CSEC, CSEC. So commercial sexual exploitation of children is what it's termed, and that's essentially human trafficking. All right, we're going to start with talking about child abductions, kidnappings, and runaways. The National Incident Studies of Missing, Abducted, Runaway, and Thrown Away Children, also deemed NISMART, is our official tool that we utilize to collect statistics about child abductions and exploitations. And in 1999, there was an estimated 1.5 million, actually 1.6 million children in the United States who had either run away or had this thrown away status or experienced one or the other episodes. That's a lot of kids. And I can tell you from my experience in child welfare, we had a lot of kids who were runaway or parents couldn't deal with them, so they kicked them out of the house and things like that. That's your thrown away status. In those episodes, though, only 21% were reported to police. And we know, looking at the victimology of those kids, that your teenagers are your primary victims of runaway or being thrown away, and it's typically ages 15 to 17. In fact, in the NISMART data, they make up about 2/3 of the full population of runaways or throwaways. And when we look at data from NISMART and looking specifically at kidnappings, we find that there are a couple of trends. So the use of force or threats were involved in most kidnappings. So it was forceful kidnapping. And then the average age of victims was 12 to 17. They were mostly white girls not living with their primary parents or adoptive parents. So those that are kidnapped are typically in that runaway or thrown away category as well. And when we talk about stereotypical kidnappings, your book defines that, and make sure you pay attention to that definition. So when we're talking about stereotypical kidnappings, we're talking about abductions which a slight acquaintance or stranger moves a child at least 20 feet or holds the child at least 1 hour, or in which the child is detained overnight, transported at least 50 miles, held for ransom, abducted with the intent to permanently keep or murder. So that is your official definition for kidnapping. Pay attention to that. So some more data that we gathered from NISMART. was that of the perpetrators. And so we see that the perpetrators of kidnappings were usually males between the ages of 18 to 35. Racial categories really didn't lend one way or the other. White or black had equal proportions of being offenders. Fewer stereotypical kidnappings ended in homicide in 2011 data compared to 1997 data. Estimates of detaining a child victim overnight were 3 times higher in the 2011 data as opposed to the 1997 data. And so what we're seeing is an increase of true kidnappings being held. And cell phones and internet assisted law enforcement in solving crimes involving 2/3 of the child victims. So that's not totally shocking because we see the influence of technology making victimization more possible, but also assisting law enforcement in solving crimes because you always leave a print wherever you go. So it's important to note to kidnappings. I think that there is a misconception primarily around murders and kidnappings. Child abductions and murders that is not associated with child abuse are relatively rare. So we talked about child abuse last week, and it's a very rare occurrence for kidnappings and victims of kidnappings to be murdered by strangers. Does it happen? Absolutely. And those are the cases that get highly publicized. So like your Adam Walsh, your Lindenberg kidnapping, Jacob Wetterling kidnapping that your book talks about. But I think that we really kind of have to put into perspective that most of your kidnappings that you will see are acquaintance kidnappings, mostly are parent kidnappings. So they don't really aren't really highly associated with murder. If there hasn't been violence within the family before. So let's define go kind of further into child abduction. There are 2 major types of child abduction. The first is fetal abduction, and this is where it's a kidnapping of a fetus right as it's born. Normally, you take the fetus from the uterus of a pregnant mother, and so like that's where people would kill the victim and remove the fetus. But then you also have infant abduction. So infant abduction is when the child is actually born naturally and is less than 6 months of age and is kidnapped at that age. So who kidnaps? Like what are our profiles of infant abductors? And we're going to focus on infant abductors. Fetus kidnappings are relatively rare. In those kidnappings that we see, we typically see it more of infants. So throughout empirical research, we have found that women between the ages of 12 and 50 who are most often overweight are compulsive and often uses manipulation and deceit to gain access to the victim, often indicates that they have either lost a baby or cannot have a baby. And they typically will kidnap infants from their own community. So they don't really go outside of their community, they know the area. We also know that they often take very good care of the infant and raise the infant as their own when they do kidnap that infant. They're often married or living with a spouse, typically a male. Um, they visit nurseries and maternity units before the abduction to kind of stake out potential victims. They usually plan the abduction, and they do that. They gain access to the infant by either posing as a nurse or other official, like hospital personnel or daycare personnel, things like that, to gain easy access. So let's transition. We've talked about infant kidnappings. Let's talk about missing children. And you've probably heard of the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, or NCMEC. I am not going to go over NCMEC in this presentation, but I will have a link in folio to NCMEC and some information about NCMEC. That is where reports are taken and distributed to try to attempt to locate missing and exploited children. But who are we talking about when we're saying the term missing children? Well, as you've probably guessed, missing children is defined as children whose whereabouts are unknown to their parents, guardian, or legal custodian. And there's typically two types of missing children. The first type are those who are specifically taken in either familial or non-familial abductions. And then the other category are those that are runaways. Or we also call them throwaways, things like that. But you'll know them that they're either abducted or they're runaways, typically. Most of the data has supported that when a child is taken, um, kidnapped, they're typically taken by a non-custodial parent. And so there are certain profiles that have been developed to kind of help us understand this parent abduction. It's very common, especially when there are custody disputes at play, there are court orders at play, things like that. So either parent may abduct his or her own child. Male and female children are equally likely to be abducted. It's not really one sex or gender over the other. Mothers are more likely to abduct after a court order, whereas fathers are more likely to abduct before it ever goes to court. Fathers who abduct are more likely to be employed, and mothers who are abduct are more likely to be unemployed. So what we kind of learned from that is some of the dynamics. We know that in custody disputes, mothers typically get custody of their children, especially in the state of Georgia. So when we see parental abductions, we see that deal with the father. We see that maybe the father doesn't have as much access to the child as they would like, or no access to the child. So they take the child because they believe the child is theirs to take. In our maternal you typically see that there's a court order in place. So that child may be in like foster care or the child welfare system, and the mom may take the child during a visit or something like that and just not return the child. We also know that most children that are taken are between the ages of 3 to 7. So they are toddlers, essentially. Communication usually occurs between the abducting parent and the searching parent. So they're highly likely to actually know that the offending parent has abducted the child. Accomplices are used in half of the cases, and they're typically another family member or a current partner to that parent. Most parental abduction cases are typically solved within the first week. So these don't last a long time. And it's because of things that we have put in place that we'll talk about, such as like Amber Alerts and NICMIC and all. So we know that parental abductions are pretty common, but we also have to talk about non-familial child abductors. And there are certain categories when we talk about non-familial child abductors who we're talking about. So the first type are pedophiles. And this is the largest single category of child abductors. So non-familial child abductors, if a child gets kidnapped by a non-family member, they are most likely to be kidnapped by a pedophile. And essentially, pedophiles gain the confidence of a child and take them. These are individuals who are sexually attracted to children and tries to go against societal norms. The next category are serial killers. These individuals are methodical and ritualistic in their approach. They use power, dominance, and control as tactics. And so their entire purpose is to fulfill some type of fantasy that deals with children. They will wind up killing the child and as a means to fulfill their ritualistic fantasy. The next type of non-familial abductor is the profiteers. Now, this is where we get into trafficking. And we're going to talk extensively about trafficking here in a little bit. But profiteers abduct children for the purposes of criminal exploitation, such as prostitution, pornography. There's also illegal adoption rings that happen. So people will abduct children and adopt them out for money. But also, when we think of profiteers, we think of sex trafficking, but there's also labor trafficking as well that we'll talk about. And then your final category of non-familial child abductors are your childless psychotics. And so this goes back to that individual who is not able to have children, who may murder the pregnant mother and rip out the fetus from the mother's womb and raise the child as their own, things like that. They abduct children in a delusional state, and they typically are trying to fill a void. So they may have lost a child, they may be infertile, they may not be able to have children, things like that. So these individuals kidnap children to take as their own and raise to fulfill some type of psychotic delusional void. So some other types of missing children that we talked about are runaways and throwaways. And so I want to kind of define these. A runaway is the majority of children who go missing. These are individuals, children, who run away from home, who either get mad or have experienced abuse or neglect in their home and can't take it anymore, and they run away. They feel that they can do better outside of their parents' home, and no one knows where they're really at. They typically will go in the streets, and then you have a higher likelihood of falling victim to human trafficking when you're on runaway. Throwaways are a little bit different. So the parents may not have technically thrown the child out with a runaway. This individual is welcome in the home, and they just choose to run away. A thrownaway is completely different. They are told to leave their household. They are not allowed entry into their household. Parents don't look for them. They're essentially abandoned and deserted. In my time at DFACS, we had a lot of runaways. We had several individuals who were thrown out of their home. and told not to come back. And a lot of times parents get to a point to where they don't know how to deal with the child's behavior, and so that leads to more incidents of thrown away. So remember when we talked about parental abductions, and I said that most of those are solved within a week of the abduction. We have made great advances not only with NICMIC's invention, which remember NICMIC is the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, but we also have this universal thing that is known as the Amber Alert system. And the Amber Alert system was created in 1996 after a child abduction in Texas. And it was developed for the sole purposes of being a warning system. So the Amber Alert system, it's very annoying sometimes, like your phones go off, your TVs go off, your radios go off, whenever someone will report a child missing. But essentially, the purpose of that alert is to alert the general public. Be on the lookout because this child is reported as either being kidnapped or runaway. And so it is credited with the safe recovery of over 880 children. So the Amber Alert system has done its job. It has allowed us to find these kidnapped children, missing children, and bring them home safely. There are certain criteria. So not everyone can just call in and say, hey, my kid's gone, I need you to issue an Amber Alert. There are certain criteria that has to be checked in order for an official Amber Alert to be processed and sent out. So the abduction has to be confirmed. It has to be verified that this child truly was abducted. And the child has to be at greater risk of injury or death, and law enforcement needs the information about the child. So a police report has to be made. Police are the ones who kind of issue that Amber Alert. And the child has to be a child. So we don't issue Amber Alerts for adults. So the individual who is missing or believed to have been kidnapped has to be at least 17 years old or less. If they're over 17, that is not a criteria to issue an Amber Alert. All right, now we're going to transition into child trafficking. There's a video here that I will have in folio for you to watch, kind of that defines human trafficking and things like that. But we need to make sure that we're all on the same page when we're talking about trafficking. So essentially, the U.S. Department of Homeland Security defines human trafficking as an act that involves the use of force, fraud, or coercion to obtain some type of labor or commercial sexual act. Millions of people are trafficked worldwide, children and adults. And trafficking is a transnational criminal enterprise. It's borderless. It happens everywhere. It is often linked to criminal activities such as like document fraud, money laundering, migrant smuggling. And children are recruited and trafficked to earn money by begging or selling goods as well. So it's not just sex trafficking. They can be forced to perform labor acts such as begging and things like that. Your book talks about some of the legislative history that we have put in place in the United States. Make sure that you pay attention to that legislative history. I'm not going to cover all of it in here because you can read, but make sure you're paying attention to some of that legislative fallout from trafficking. This slide as well that I will link to folio for you to watch. But I want to ask you, would you know if someone was being trafficked if you were in the same room as them. How would you know? We often think that there's one magical sign of human trafficking that we can all universally recognize and and immediately know that that is a victim of human trafficking. As depressing as it sounds, I'm here to tell you that's not correct. In fact, there's no one sign. There are multiple signs that could potentially lead someone to suspect that someone is being trafficked, but it is a congregation of different signs that come together. And Know the Signs of Human Trafficking video is a great video for you to watch and kind of learn from. It kind of tells you the different types of signs. So whenever I teach this in Universal Justice, I typically will have you write down different signs that you think. Tattoos and branding are very common in sex trafficking. Older paramours, so if like a 14 or 15-year-old individual has a 32 or 42-year-old boyfriend or girlfriend, that is a huge red flag. If they have goods that they can't afford normally, and they just come to school with the brand new pair of Jordans or the brand new iPhone, and you're like, where did they get that? They can't afford food. That might be something that you want to look closer into. So this Know the Signs video is a great video of you to just kind of become more aware of signs, but know that there's no one universal sign. I used to have to tell teachers this all the time when I train them. There's no one sign. So if little Jennifer comes into class with a brand new iPhone and you can't figure out how she got it, that doesn't mean that she's being trafficked. Her parents might have won a lottery ticket or something and got her a new phone. But if little Jennifer comes in with diamonds and talking about her boyfriend who bought her all of this stuff and is tired because she stays up all night, and then she starts looking frazzled, not clean, things like that, that leads to more likelihood of trafficking. So you see how all the signs kind of add together. And you have to use critical thinking skills when talking about this and kind of putting pieces together like a puzzle. So there are certain elements that I want you to remember when we're talking about human trafficking. Human trafficking is forced labor. It is distinctive from exploitative labor, and forced labor is being forced to do something. Being forced to have sex for money. Being forced to work in horrendous conditions and turn over your paycheck to someone. These victims are controlled or owned by this employer. Employer can be a pimp, can be just a regular employer, things like that. They are treated as a commodity and they have restraints on their freedom. They are not free to leave. Human trafficking victims are not free to leave their environment. Talking about child trafficking specifically, your book does a great job kind of breaking down the types of child trafficking victims. This is your table 7.3, and I want you to pay very close attention to this. So there are several different types of trafficking that we're talking about. It ranges from like infant adoptions, so infant kids being kidnapped and then adopted out. And you'll see that UNICEF internationally, UNICEF kind of looked at Guatemala, and UNICEF estimates that about 1,000 to 1,500 Guatemalan infants are trafficked each year. So infants are taken, kidnapped from their Guatemalan parents and adopted out. You also have mail order brides, which are mainly from Asia or Eastern Europe. They are forced to be married off and sent out from their homeland. You also then have domestic work and sexual exploitation, which is kind of what you think of whenever you think of human trafficking, or the general consensus of human trafficking thinks of forced sexual exploitation, forced prostitution, things like that. So internationally, child trafficking is a major business. And even here in the United States, we see a lot of child sex trafficking and things like that. So then you have child sex workers, child prostitution and pornography. Forced child labor is something that is relatively new, and I will probably put the laws in folio for you to look at, but our code in Georgia has recently been revitalized to include labor trafficking. And essentially labor trafficking, we see immigrants being brought here under false pretenses and forced to work off their debt. So when I worked for DFACS, I had one case of child labor that I was a part of, where a 17-year-old, we got a report that he wasn't going to school. So when we got there to investigate, we found that his host home brought him over from Mexico and forced him to work in their restaurant. But he had to pay his own rent. He had to buy his own food. He had to pay his own bills. This host home he called uncle, but it wasn't a biological family member. It essentially was a place to rent, and he was forced to pay them back for bringing him here and providing him a place to live. So he was working all these hours and really not free to leave because he had nowhere to go. So you see that forced child labor. We also see child labor overseas in factories, so sweatshops, things like that. One area of child trafficking that is not talked about enough is child soldiers. And child soldiers essentially involves the unlawful recruitment or use of children as combatants or for labor or sexual exploitation by armed forces. You see this a lot overseas, especially in like Rwanda, the Congo, things like that. So how do individuals get involved in child trafficking? And when we're talking about child trafficking here, we're going to talk specifically about child sexual exploitation. Your book calls it child prostitution. I don't like the term prostitution when we're talking about child sex trafficking, because prostitution implies that they are choosing to live this life of selling their body for sex, for money. All too often, the criminal justice system has viewed these victims as offenders, as prostitutes. And they have been labeled that, and the negative connotation that comes from being a prostitute has lived with these child victims. But going forward, we have realized that they are victims, and we have embarked on legislation to help treat them as victims. So while your book uses child prostitution, I will use sex trafficking. So there are several different ways that individuals get into the sex trafficking realm, and especially children. So parents are typically your first socialization tools into the world, and that is no different for child sex trafficking. Parents as a role model is a avenue that is more common than you would care to imagine. One of the worst cases of child sex trafficking that I had was a parent who used her 5 and 6 year old to pay the rent and pay bills. So she would allow her landlord to take her children and have sex with them. She would allow other men to come into the home and use her children to give her money so that she could pay bills. So, in essence, that was a parent facilitated child sex trafficking ring. And we see this a lot. Children are exposed to this notion of using their body for financial gain because their parents do. And so whether it's parent facilitated or parent modeled, parents are an avenue to this. There's also something called parental incest as an avenue for child sex trafficking. And so here we see that some children are initiated into sexual activity through parental sexual abuse. The parent begins in the incest and videotapes or photographs the child, and then will gradually bring other adults in for sex acts. So you kind of see it starting with incest and kind of gradually growing into child pornography and then going into full-blown child sex trafficking. We have child sex rings that include multiple children within a group of individuals. Incest, sexual abuse are higher risk for victimization. If you've been victimized through sexual abuse, there's higher risk that you will fall into human trafficking a little bit later, is what some of the empirical evidence has shown us. So our final slide, we're going to discuss who are the offenders that that exploit children for sexual purposes. So we know a lot about child sex offenders. And we know that child sex offenders can either use force or coercion. If they coerce their victims, this is a highly manipulative technique. Coercion is a highly manipulative technique in that the offender will develop a relationship with the child that seems innocent at first. And so some common techniques that they utilize would be to manipulate the child's need for belonging or adult approval, human contact. We see a lot of coercion going on with offenders who have high contact with children, who are in professions that work with children, have relationships with children that are not supposed to be sexual. And they use the manipulation or the power to coerce the child into sex acts. Another motive is through force. And so force is just like it sounds. The offender will force the child into sex acts through threats, intimidation, or physical violence. All child sex offenders are attracted to children. And I think that's a common misconception with child sex offenders, or with sex offenders who perpetrate on children. There are situational sex offenders who will abuse a child just because the child is there. So with situational motive, it's highly impulsive. And so we see evidence of impulsive, opportunistic, predatory behavior. They have the opportunity, because they're there with a child, they're going to sexually abuse that child. Or they're going to kidnap that child because the child is there and they need money, so they're going to sell the child. These individuals do not have a true preference for children, true sexual preference for children, but engage in sex for various reasons. It can be highly intricate, but essentially situational offenders are impulsive and just use that opportunity as just that. That is opposed to what we call the preferential offender. Preferential offenders mean to abuse children. They have strong sexual preferences and are attracted to children, and they have specific behavior patterns and sexual rituals that involve children as part of the rituals. Often have clear evidence that the offender has thought, planned, and went searching for a particular victim, as opposed to the situational offender, where the situational offender is just taking advantage of the situation they're in. The preferential offender is highly motivated to include a child. They do this through their contact means. So think about you as an adult. You have either high contact or low contact with children. And offenders typically, especially if they're preferential offenders, will typically try to put themselves in high contact situations with children. So that will become coaches, pastors, daycare workers, teachers, probation officers, court workers, school personnel, lunchroom people, all of that, to where they are in high concentrated areas with children. They seek to have long-term opportunities to offend and not really get caught. That is opposed to low contact. And low contact is exactly what that means. They don't really have the opportunity on a daily basis to be in contact with children. So you can see how the situational offender may realistically have low contact with children, but when they do have contact with children, they use that situation. So that's kind of how our typologies play out with offenders. You have those offenders who have the strong preference for children, and either use coercion or force to gain access to that child, and either coerce that child into building a relationship to then take advantage of them, or to completely force that child into a sexual relationship. All right, that is our full presentation for this week. I know that this was very heavy. Like I said at the beginning, please take care of yourself. Make sure you do the readings. I'm going to have a lot of supplemental material for you. There's several videos as well as the NISMART information. So please make sure you take advantage of looking over that stuff. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. Otherwise, I will see you next week.